Hey everybody, my name's Razor. Welcome to another tutorial and welcome back if you've been here before. Today I decided to challenge myself and I'm going to cook up a drill beat using only free sounds. So sounds I can find either in free drum kits or free VST instruments. If you look around in the right places you can find some really good free sounds. You can often get preview or light versions of full drum kits for example, and there are lots of good quality free VSTs out there. No budget? No problem. I got you. So with all that being said, let's get into the cook-up. So to start with, I wanted to find some good drum kits and drum sounds, and I looked around and I came up with these. I think they're pretty decent, especially when you consider they're free. First of all, shout out to Jay Sauls. He's got a Ragnarok drum kit out at the moment, and this is the light version of that. It's free and available to download on his website now. When it comes to cooking up drill, my go-to drum kits are often the J Cactus Prick kits. On his website he's got preview versions of the Prick Kit Volume 2, 3 and 4, so I got those as well because they're available for free and I know they're good quality sounds. Lastly, I took the NY Drill mini drum kit that's mine. That's available for free on my website right now, and that's got some FX and perks and things like that in there that I'm hoping will fill in some gaps if the free preview and live versions that I've got don't have exactly what I need. I'll leave a link in the description for that kit and the other free kits as well. And now for the free instruments and VSTs. First of all, shout out to Patent Sounds for their The Hotel Piano and Vintage Strings plugins. These only came out the other day, but they're free, they're fire, and already I've been using them a lot. Next I've gone for the Creepy Piano plugin. It's a really nice sounding piano, especially the Coffin Rock preset. After that I went for Arturia's new free plugin, Augmented Strings. I love strings, especially in drill or melodic drill, and these are particularly good, especially when you consider they're free. And then of course you have to go for Labs. Labs is goated. It's free, they update it all the time, some of the banks are amazing. I was looking around for a free choir sound. Labs has got a choir, I know it's really good and I already have it, so that's perfect. And lastly, I love vocals, particularly female vocals, in my drill beats. I'm always looking around for free vocals because they're not the easiest thing to find, but companies like Cymatics, Slate Digital, release packs every now and again. Slate Digital did one called Omnivox last year sometime and I got that. It was certainly free then, I think it still is free, but that's got some really nice vocals. So I went through that pack and picked out some that I thought were going to sound nice and work in the track. As far as effects go, there's a mini riser in my pack which I'm going to use, but I'm looking for a main riser, and the ones that came in the free packs weren't really what I was looking for. One thing when you're using free sounds and plugins is you've got to get a bit more creative. So I looked through the packs for crashes and things like that in packs. I found a nice one in Jay's kit. I then just reversed it, added some reverb, and I've got my riser. I think we're ready to start cooking up. So I started with the Augmented Strings and started to build some chords. I'm liking how this one's sounding in F minor, so I'm going to keep it here for the time being. We can always change it later on if we need to. Copy that across again and move it down. Move the middle note if we need to make it a major rather than a minor chord. And then drop it down one more semitone. And already we've got a nice sounding chord progression. I tried something different at the end of the 4 bars, didn't sound quite right. You don't win every time, so I went back to the original. I then copied those 4 bars across to make it 8 bars, and then I'm going to change the last bar a little bit for variation to stop it sounding repetitive and keep the listener interested. In this case I chopped the bar in half and dropped the second half of that bar down by 2 semitones, and I like the way it's sounding, so I'm happy with that. And then to keep it from sounding so robotic, I'm going to play with the velocities a little bit. By pressing Alt and R, you bring up the randomized velocity function. You can play with the velocity knobs and you can also change between seeds as well until you get something you're happy with. And that's sounding nice now, happy with that, but I think it needs some bass notes, so I'm going to add them as well. So it's just a simple case of taking the root notes, adding them in a couple of octaves down to give it that bass. And in the first two bars it's the same thing that plays twice, so rather than have it do that at the bass level, I've just made it one note that plays across the two bars. I think that sounds a bit nicer at the bass and adds a little bit of variation as well. The second half of the 8 bars I've copied it across, making sure to make that change at the end of the last bar where we chopped it in half and lowered it down to the A sharp. For some reason when it played the A sharp it didn't sound quite right, didn't sound full enough, so I moved it up 1 octave and that sounded much nicer. So next I wanted to add a bass piano layer, and I went for the creepy piano because I know it sounds nice down at those lower octaves. I used the Coffin Rock preset and I just copied those root notes from the strings. Again, I just randomised the velocities with Alt and R, so it wasn't quite as robotic sounding. Then I opened up the Patent Sound Vintage Strings, and I basically copied the chords from the Augmented Strings without the bass. These strings are more of a pizzicato string, that sort of short stab, so they sound nice on top of the other strings because it adds a kind of depth, a different feel. Again, I copied them across to the second half of the 8 bars, factored in that variation at the end of the 8th bar, and changed the velocity so they sounded nicer. I also added in some passing notes for a little bit of variation. For the hotel piano layer, I took the Augmented Strings and copied that into the hotel piano. At first it was a little bit hard to hear, so at this point I took all my instrument layers and routed them to separate channels on the mixer. I could then mess with the levels to make sure I could hear all the instruments. It's starting to sound nice now, but I still want to use that choir layer if I can. At first I tried the top note of the chords, but I ended up preferring how it sounded using the root notes. So basically I took the root notes of the chords and then had a second copy of those 1 octave up. This both sounds nice but also gives it a larger range and depth, so it'll be easier to hear when I EQ it later. As always, I messed with the velocities a little bit and the seeds as well, just trying to make it a little bit easier to hear and also natural sounding. Now for the effects and the mixer, obviously it's free sound, so it has to be free plugins as well when it comes to mixing, so I'm going to use the standard fruity parametric EQ. For the hotel piano I took out some of the lows because it wasn't that bassy, and a tiny bit of the highs. I took out more of the lows and used a harsher cut on the creepy piano because that was obviously a bassier sound and I want to make room for my own bass later on. I also took out some of the highs. It wasn't filling up those frequencies really anyway, but I like to take it out to avoid clashes just in case, even if it looks like it isn't filling those frequencies up. For the vintage strings, took out some of the lows, boosted the mid to mid highs a little bit and ducked some of the highs. For the augmented strings, took out some of the lows and the highs but boosted the mids as I wanted those to be heard there a little bit more. And for the choir, I was trying to make it heard above other things, so I ended up going between that and the strings EQs and just messing around a little bit until I was happy with the levels and that the balance was right. I then added some fruity reverb to the vintage strings to take the harshness off a little bit. I then added the same reverb to the choir. I also separated the signal a little bit. And finally added a pancake so the choir sound moves from left to right, as this makes it a little bit easier to hear. Lastly, I added fruity reverb to the creepy piano, and I took out a little bit more of the lows as I thought it was sounding a little bit too bassy and muddy. Then I just played with the levels a little bit more until I was happy with it and I could hear everything how I wanted to hear it, and now I'm happy that it's ready to arrange and start adding drums, etc. The first thing I like to do is add the 808, and for this I just took the root notes from the chords and copied them in just to see how it sounds against the melody. This is only really a placeholder and a guide, and I'll obviously change the notes as I build the 808 later on. So for the drums I'll start off with a counter snare. I'll start off with a basic pattern, copy it out to the 8 bars, and then go back and make changes, add rolls, etc. So what I did here once I had the 8 bars built out was play it through and start to take things out where I thought space would be good. I like to add space in the counter snare because it builds up anticipation for the next note, and also when you add things in later on it makes it more impactful. I stopped at this point because I thought a roll would sound good here. One quick and easy way to get a roll in FL is to drag your note out the length you want the roll to be. Press Alt and U and that brings up the chopper. You can then play with the time knob to get as many chops as you want. I then ended up deleting the second half of the 8 bars and copying the first half across instead. I could then make some small changes to the second half for variation and stop it sounding the same. The second counter snare I add at the 4th and the 8th bars, and what I like to do with this one is have it panning from side to side randomly, and I also make sure it's a different kind of sound to the first counter snare so that you can hear it. What I tend to do is add notes where I can see there are gaps in the ghost notes, and then towards the end of the bar I have something cascading down, and then I play with the velocities a little bit for even more bounce. And for the third counter snare, I like to add something just a little bit different, more bounce again, at the start of the bar and halfway through the 8 bars. So it's just those 3 notes, different velocities, and again a different sounding counter snare to add to that bounce even further. And for the snares, nothing crazy, just that standard drill pattern, making it hit hard by increasing the velocity, and I like to double up the snare in the final bar just to add some variation. I ended up messing around with the kick for quite a while, going back and forth between the samples to see which one I preferred, as the one that I normally use from the Brick Kit 4 isn't in the preview. Once I was happy with the sound, I laid down the pattern and moved on to the perks. I had a couple of perks, one that was called Drill that was kind of a shakery sound, and one that sounded a bit like a washed out triangle. I just played the drums on a loop, looking for spaces where I thought the two would sound nice, and messed around with them in those spaces, and the velocities as well, until I was happy that the bounce was right. Now that I was happy with the drums, I could separate out those channels as well and put those into the playlist. Then I could reactivate the 808 channel and start building that up using the original as a guide for the note placements. I messed around for quite a while, messing with note placements, making sure that I stayed in key, changing note lengths where I felt I needed to, adding slides as well, until I was happy with the overall 808 pattern. By the time I finished arranging the beat, there'll be multiple 808 patterns, but this is the first one. Once I started to arrange it, I was looking for a place to put the vocals. Originally I thought they were going to go in the hook, but then as I started to arrange, I thought maybe they could go in the intro as well. As far as processing for the vocals go, I put them all on the same mixer track, and then I added a fruity convolver as opposed to fruity reverb. I used the smooth cathedral preset as I think this sounds nice. Then I added Pancake, lowered the mix level down to about 50% so it wasn't moving too much, and I also set it to 1 bar rather than the default 2 bars. Finally I added an EQ, took out the lows, boosted the mid-highs and took out a tiny bit of the lows. After all this I felt the vocals sat in the mix a lot nicer and was happy with how they sounded. So I want to have just the instruments with no drums playing in the 8-bar intro, but then I want to introduce the vocals for the second 8 bars. For the final bar before the drop hits, I've taken out all of the instruments, leaving just the counter snare, the snare and the vocals, along with that reverse crash that I'm using as a riser. I find that by stripping a lot of the elements out for the bar just before the drop, along with adding a riser as well, makes the drop hit that much harder. So you can see for the hook, for the first 8 bars I've got all the instruments playing and all the drums at the same time. And then for the second 8 bars I've introduced the vocals again. As I said before, I didn't want the vocals playing all the way through, because that would have been 24 bars of vocals in a row and it would have been too samey, and I think it would have lost some of the effect. This way I get to keep the vocals in the intro and the hook as well, but doesn't run the risk of sounding too similar. and then onto the verse, and I'm thinking I'm going to have a 24 bar verse with an 8 bar bridge at the end, so 32 bars in total. I like this arrangement because it gives me a chance to bring in elements every 8 bars or so, but also the bridge breaks it all down, which then makes the second drop for the second hooks more impactful. So here you can see that I'm taking out elements until I'm happy with it. I ended up leaving the augmented strings and the hotel piano, and then halfway through the first 8 bars introduced the bass piano. Then kept all those things playing for the next 8 bars and introduced the vintage strings as well. Before finally introducing the choir for the final 8 bars of the 24 before the bridge. And then for the bridge itself, I've got the augmented strings in the choir, and then added in the vocals, which I think ended up sounding nice. I then copied the hooks across with the same format as before, so the riser leading into the hooks. So the first 8 bars without the vocals, and the second 8 bars with the vocals. Then when it comes to the drums, in the first 8 bars I just want the counter snare and the snare playing, and then I'll introduce the 808 and the kick in the next 8 bars. Keep that the same for the next 8 bars after that, and then obviously take them all out for the bridge. At some point I'll go back and take little bits out of the drum, so a couple of bars of snare or counter snare missing here, maybe take out the 808s, kick, etc., just to give it some variation and stop it from being the same. Then I decided to add some effects to the melody as a whole, and in keeping with the spirit of free plugins only, instead of going to RC20 I went to vinyl, which I've not used for a long time, but you can get a nice sounding warmer tone quite easily with that. I also wanted to add something extra to the bridge, so I added a Fruity Love filter. I chose the simple bandpass preset and messed around with the X and Y until it got that underwater sound. I then automated it so I could turn it off for every other section and leave it on just for the bridge, and I also messed around with the automation inside the bridge to give it a little bit of variation and stop it sounding exactly the same all the way through. Finally, here I am doing what I said I was going to go back and do, taking out little bits from the counter snare, the kick and 808, just to stop it sounding the same, add some variation, keep the listener interested, and generally just make it a bit more interesting for anybody really. So then it's on to making different 808 patterns. I use the original as a base, make the copy unique, and then I can edit it without affecting the original. In the verse 808s, I want to make them simpler overall, so I might take out some slides. If there are 2 notes hitting next to each other, I might replace them with just 1 note. This stops the verse being so busy, and also makes the hook have more energy because in comparison, it's got the slides and more notes, etc. So after messing around for a little bit, I came up with a simpler pattern that I was happy with for a verse. Obviously to change the 808s, in particular the placement of the notes, you might have to go back, make your kick pattern unique as well, and take out certain notes that were hitting before where 808s were but aren't anymore. Finally, I ended up making a third 808 pattern. I liked the one I made for the verse, but I wanted a bit of variation for when it plays just before the bridge, so the slides go a little bit higher. It gives it a little bit of a different feel going into the bridge. And last but not least, as I'm playing it through, sometimes I think maybe there's too many 808s still, even with the simplified pattern. So I'll go through, chop a few notes out, change a couple of things until I'm happy there's not too much 808 in there, and there's plenty of space left for the wrapper. Once all that is done, I'm looking for a way to try and end the beat nicely, and in this case I took those augmented strings, and because it plays the same thing for the first 2 bars, I made it unique and had it playing once across the 2 bars. And then I added the automation to the master volume and had it fade out, which I think sounded nice and a good way to finish. And that's pretty much everything. I hope you like the way the beat turned out, and if you're not subscribed already, make sure to hit that subscribe button, the bell and the notification so you never miss any uploads. I upload beats, drill remixes, tutorials, sample packs, free sample packs all the time, so make sure you don't miss out. Until next time, stay safe, be productive, and I'll catch you on the next one.